Phoenix and I are exploring San Francisco's wild side. First, the Aquarium of the Bay, where every animal comes from the very waters the fog rolls in from, to Alcatraz, where we learn some history you might not know about either. Phoenix loves aquariums. Hands down, they are one of our favorite things. And what makes the Aquarium of the Bay so special? Every single creature here is a native of the San Francisco Bay. Those cool jellyfish, you guessed it, they live in the bay. From the moon jellyfish to the sea nettle, they thrive in estuaries like the San Francisco Bay. They are opportunistic feeders, which means they eat plankton and small fish, and they can multiply rapidly if conditions are just right. This isn't just a place to visit, it's a mission. Aquarium of the Bay is part of a larger nonprofit called Bay Aquarium, and together they are working to protect and restore one of the most important estuaries of the West Coast. And why is this one of the most important estuaries of the West Coast? Well, it's home to over 500 species of wildlife, including endangered species like Chinook salmon. The mix of fresh and salt water makes it ideal for shellfish to grow and spawn, especially species like Dungeness crab. And juvenile fish rely on these protected, nutrient-rich waters to grow before moving on to the open ocean. The Aquarium of the Bay is San Francisco's only Smithsonian-affiliated aquarium, and it helps produce the science, education, and community involvement needed to protect the bay's future. Even the graceful bat rays to the spotted leopard sharks, these guys aren't just on display. They are neighbors. And another cool fact we learned while we were there, the water housing the animals, it also comes from the bay. The aquarium's efforts connect frontline youth education like free field trips to real-world research and public policy, such as supporting legislation to reduce plastic pollution and promoting sustainable shoreline restoration. And it's not just science, it's hands-on. They have a program called Diving for Citizen Science, where trained volunteers help restore kelp forests, which are vital for everything, from the sea lions, otters, and fish nurseries to shoreline protection. Aquarium of the Bay isn't huge, but it's packed with a purpose. Every exhibit, every class, and every rescued animal, they are helping people fall in love with the bay and inspiring them to protect it. It's easy to think of places like this as just tourist stops, but this one is part of a much bigger purpose. As we stepped off the ferry onto Alcatraz, Phoenix and I were immediately confused. Why was there vandalism on the huge sign? How did anyone even gain entry to do such a thing? You've heard about Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and the Birdman of Alcatraz. But what history class hadn't taught me was about the indigenous occupation of Alcatraz Island from 1969 to 1971. The occupation was led by an activist group called Indians of All Tribes. They stayed for over 19 months, bringing national attention to native rights, broken treaties, the need for recognition, and they are what saved the island for tourists today. Alcatraz closed as a prison in 1963. Its official last day was March 21st, 1963. And let's look at the list of why it closed, and it's a long list. At the time, it was the most expensive prison per operating costs in the U.S. And you have to think about why. Everything, and I mean everything, had to be shipped in. Water, food, fuel, supplies, you name it, and it was shipped by a boat. Staff and their families also had to live on the island, and that was 60 to 80 families at any given time. This included wives and children of prison guards, maintenance personnel, and administrators. And why did this add to the ever-growing cost of expenses for the island? Well, along with electricity and waste disposal, children living on the island attended school on the mainland. and that meant daily boat rides. And you can't just send children willy-nilly. The additional costs included supervision and safety measures. It's also important to note that the island had no freshwater source. Over 1 million gallons of fresh water had to be shipped in monthly on a barge. Oh, and wastewater, it had to be removed the same way. I'm sure you can start to see that operations were a logistical nightmare and over the top expensive. Alcatraz was built in 1912 as a military prison, not originally intended for long-term use. Decades of saltwater exposure took its toll, and renovations in 1960 would have cost the government $3 million. That is $31 million today. To be fair, the island's location made security easier, but operations harder and more costly. Harsh weather, fog, and currents made transporting staff and supplies dangerous and unpredictable, and medical emergencies were almost impossible to respond to. The occupation of Alcatraz is deeply rooted in the larger context of policy towards Native Americans, especially the termination era. It's important to note that by the time the activists took over the island in 1969, Alcatraz had already been abandoned as a prison for 6 years. But it was anything but empty to Native Americans. It became a symbol of broken promises, lost land, and survival. The occupation was in response to a brutal federal policy called termination, an effort to erase Native nations by ending federal recognition, dismantling tribal governments, and pushing Native Americans to assimilate in urban areas. Over 100 tribes were terminated under this policy, and hundreds of thousands of Native Americans were displaced. Yet again, in many areas like San Francisco, many found poverty, racism, and isolation instead of the opportunities they were promised. My heart hurts. It's like a broken record playing over and over again. But what made the occupation of Alcatraz so powerful? Under an old 1868 treaty, any unused federal land was supposed to be returned to the native people. So when the prison closed, activists argued they had a legal and moral right to reclaim the island. The occupation wasn't easy. Supplies were limited and the federal government cut off electricity and water. But their presence forced the country to look at the Native American issues in a new light, not as relics of the past, but as living, resisting nations. They were eventually removed by federal marshals in 1971, but the spark they created grew, and a wave of indigenous activism grew across the country and pushed the U.S. government to abandon the termination policy. Today, the graffiti remains, but not as an act of vandalism, but as a reminder. Now, Alcatraz is part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, making it a protected national park. Beyond its infamous history, the island is also a surprising sanctuary for life. Hundreds of seabirds nest here each year, filling the crumbling houses with sound and baby birds. And Phoenix couldn't get enough of the baby seagulls. We spent so much of our time watching them. And that's another reminder that a place once known for isolation and imprisonment can transform into something wild, peaceful, and free. Alcatraz has one of the largest western gull colonies in California, and along with the gulls, a few other species of birds nest here as well. We saw a ton of the Brant cormorant, which are black seabirds, pigeons, black-crowned night herons, snowy egret, and Canadian geese also sometimes nest here as well, although the geese don't nest in large numbers. The island is a smorgasbord of birds, and we loved seeing them all. With no natural predators on the island and protected under the care of the National Park Service, the island is an essential nesting ground for seabirds. And just beyond some of the walkways and cliffs, another transformation quietly blooms. The Alcatraz Gardens. Once tended by inmates and guards and later lost to time, they have now been carefully restored. These resilient terraces now overflow with color cared for by volunteers and park staff. Another reminder that life can bloom where despair once lived. But the island's beauty only stretches so far. Step inside the main cell block and you're met with a stark reminder of what Alcatraz truly was. The first stop for inmates, the showers. Here under the fluorescent lights and cold pipes, prisoners were stripped, deloused, and forced to shower, often with scalding hot or icy cold water, depending on the guard's mood. Their clothes were burned, their heads shaved, and their old lives officially erased. And it's important to add that it was more than hygiene protocol. It was psychological, a ritual designed to erase identity and reinforce the isolation that defined life on the rock. The main cell house is part of a self-guided walking tour, and it's one of the most powerful parts of the Alcatraz experience. With a headset and audio recorder in hand, you explore the corridors at your own pace, hearing the stories right where they happened. But what makes it truly haunting is who you are listening to: former guards and former inmates. Their voices echo through the cell block, sharing memories of daily routines, escape attempts, and the long, slow passing of time. It's not just a tour, it's a conversation between the past and the present. The voices guiding you belong to men who knew these halls better than anyone. You'll hear from Bill Baker, a former inmate who spent time in these actual cells and wrote about it later in his life, and from Jim Albright, one of the last guards to serve on Alcatraz before it closed in 1963. And they aren't just recounting history, they lived it. Each voice adds a layer of truth that no reenactment ever could. You're not just learning about the rock, you're hearing it straight from those who locked the doors and those who were locked behind them. Eventually, my path led me outside to what was known as the recreation yard, though that term feels generous. It's surrounded by 25-foot-high walls and gun towers. The concrete walls did nothing to stop the harsh, frigid wind coming off the bay, and this was the only outdoor space inmates were allowed. And only for a few hours a week if they followed the rules. Some played cards if the weather allowed it, some walked laps in silence, and San Francisco across the bay was only briefly glimpsed while descending down the steps. Cell Block D. This is the most famous of all the cell blocks, known as the Special Treatment Unit for solitary confinement and segregation. It housed the prison's most dangerous inmates, including those with behavioral issues, and one of the most infamous inmates of Cell Block D was the Birdman of Alcatraz. After killing a guard, he was moved to Cell Block D for the remainder of his sentence. And it's interesting to note that the other inmates did not view him as the gentle, bird-loving figure portrayed in the movie. Accounts from former inmates describe him as dangerous, violent, manipulative, and sinister. And while Alcatraz did house some of America's most notorious criminals, not all were there for murder or more serious offenses. In the context of Alcatraz, it was less about the severity of the initial charge and more about the inmate's history of troublemaking or high escape risk. So, a series of lesser offenses could build up to a transfer to the Rock. One of the most soul-stirring revelations during my tour was learning that members of the military served time at Alcatraz. From 1934 to 1963, military members were imprisoned due to a sexual psychopath diagnosis, which was a deliberate policy to send military personnel to Alcatraz for homosexuality. At the time, homosexual men were portrayed as a menace to the public, particularly children and families, and the state used incarceration to control them. Gay men were targeted specifically, and J. Edgar Hoover approved the transfer of over 20 military men to Alcatraz. As I brought up earlier, Alcatraz was never meant for the long-haul stays. Originally designed as a military fortress, then a short-term detention site, it slowly changed from its initial intended purpose to an overcrowded prison that not only lacked space, but programs for reform as well. At this point, it wasn't just the concrete that was cracking. The entire idea that human beings could be locked away, forgotten, and somehow come back to society reformed was starting to show its flaws. So, by the early 1960s, something was shifting in the penal system, not just the budget. There was a growing concern that isolation, cold concrete, and psychological punishment weren't really justice after all. By the 1980s and 90s, a new kind of crisis was unfolding: mass incarceration. The war on drugs didn't just target crime, it targeted communities. Minor, nonviolent drug offenses suddenly carried major consequences. And the 1994 Three Strikes and You're Outlaw, signed by President Clinton, pushed even more people into long-term sentences, sometimes for life. Reform programs, treatment, community investment could have made a difference. Instead, we doubled down and chose longer sentences and more prison. Now, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, more than any other country on earth. And that's not justice, that's a money-making machine. And let me be clear, some people absolutely need to be in prison. There are violent, dangerous individuals who pose real threats. But the system we've built punishes addiction, poverty, and mental illness, and then expects change to come from a cage. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Make sure to subscribe to see where we end up next.